So I'm going to share my screen. This work that I'm sharing with you has become a passion of mine. It is, I hope you can see the slide. Can you see those slides? Is it working? Yeah? Okay. And this has become a real passion of mine. And it started with some work I did almost 10 years ago when I started thinking about this problem. And I was really worried about false positives. And so Andy and King and I wrote a paper, and we kind of tried to import this word called apophenia, which just rolls off the tongue. I really like this word, apophenia. It means delusions in psychology. It's like a diagnosis. And so we thought, well, what if things are we thought about scientific apophenia, which is what if you're learning from things that you shouldn't be learning, and that's kind of delusional. And then we thought about the problem. Everybody called us naysayers, and you're just trying to ruin everything. And, there's all these false positives in the literature. By the way, in the paper, it was about 30 to 30% maybe of the results you're reading, you maybe shouldn't quite believe. And then Andy went down this rabbit hole in the philosophy of testimony. And it turned out to be this magical place. And I'm going to kind of walk you through that here a little bit, maybe. And we'll come out with some solutions on the other side, which I think are really intriguing. And so the first claim I'm going to make is that most empirical research that you read in the social sciences generally, and in strategy certainly in particular, are some type of theory paper. And the second claim is you can future-proof your work so that the replication crisis will not hit you. Right? And you can do that without magic and by some pretty simple steps. So I'm going to back up. I'm going to talk about claims. These are, when we talk about testimony in our work, it's really written papers, or this is a form of verbal testimony right now. There are certain types of researcher claims. There are explanations, frequencies, and beliefs. And I'm going to define a word. This is another big word that really rolls off the tongue, comes right out of the philosophy of science, called veridicality. Okay, so you can see verify is a similar sort of word. So veridicality is competent and sincere testimony. So if a blind person claims to have seen the murderer in a dark night, right, that is not veridical. They may be sincere. They may think they saw the person, but it's not competent. I'm not going to work about sincerity. I think most people are trying to do the right thing and tell the truth, but I am going to focus on that first thing, and that's really the bulk of this little talk. First, I'm going to start with explanations. So explanations are just explaining the data. They're conjectures. Okay, and here's an example of one that's in the literature, and I'm going to read this. A possible explanation for this result, It doesn't even matter what comes after this. This is clearly an opinion. And because it's an opinion, it's not a claim to truth. It's veridical, right? It is both sincere and competent, okay? So those are the easiest. So it might be this. So, opinions are opinions. We learned that. My kids learned about opinions, in fact, in 5th grade or 4th grade or something. That's what this is, an opinion. Okay. Now we're going to get to frequencies. So most of Andreas just gave me a little smile there because he's like, but I'm a Bayesian. But we're not Bayesians mostly, right? He lives in a sect, according to Markus, so we're good. And so we have frequencies and the problems, and I call it the problem of P. Right? So what is a frequency? A frequency is a factual claim. It is a fact. It is a prediction of a future frequency in a population based on your sample, but it's a prediction of what you're going to see outside the sample. It is fundamentally an inductive statement. You're inducing from the sample, from the specific to the general. Right? Now, it's a very specific type of statement. It's a statement about an identical test with an identically constructed sample. Okay? So if you're making a statement, say, about legitimacy, the p-value is only telling you about what would happen if you measure everything exactly the same way and you use a sample from exactly the same population. Okay, so here's an example of a frequency claim that we might see in the literature. Both measures of objective performance were significantly positively associated with risky outlays at, and here's the p-value. That is literally a frequency claim. Okay, veridicality requires pre-specification. And this is the bear of our world. Pre-specification, particularly with archival data, is really, really hard to do. Like really hard. I have not been able to do it well. There's a few tricks, right? But it's very hard. And the reason is because of researcher degrees of freedom. Okay? So I'm not going to ask you, don't read everything in the slide. Please don't read everything in the slide. Focus on me. Don't read, listen. Okay, right? But you just look at my arrow. So we have sampling decisions, how to construct our sample, how to measure the construct, in this case, the dependent variable. What is the predictor variable or the independent variable of interest, which controls to include the time period. These are all different choices the researcher makes, and they're really hard to make before you start. Because what happens if you go down the list and somebody says, well, what about that control variable? And you add it in, right? So now it's no longer pre-specified, right? That happens all the time, super hard to do, okay? Belief claims, okay? A belief claim is a different thing, right? And this actually fits very well into the world of Bayes. Okay? It's the probability that H, your hypothesis, is true, conditional on the evidence. Okay? But to make a belief claim, here's an example. Our analysis indicates that the presence of local social movements was responsible, notice the causal statement there, for this regional variation in wind energy. Okay? Veridicality requires that the data are likely given H and the data are unlikely given any other H. Okay? Sometimes this is called invertibility, right? But that is that's basically what we think of when we think of identification. Okay? Now, here's the tricky part. Belief claims often rely on frequency statistics. And frequency claims, we just noted the problems with them. So these are connected problems. Okay. So, so here's what I got. We've got this veridicality alert, right? And I'm trying to like get this word veridicality into your minds, right? And it's kind of a mouthful. I'm working on another paper and we're using the word verisimilitude, which is another really fun word, right? But it's harder to say than veridicality. It's taken me some practice. Okay, so frequency claims without pre-specification, not justified. Okay, they're not veridical. And then that's the paper that Andy and I wrote about scientific apophenia. Here's another veridicality alert. Belief claims that fail to rule out alternatives or rely on unjustified frequency claims are themselves not justified. Right? So they're not veridical. Explanations are explicitly opinions, so we're good. They're not claims to truth, right? So there's no veridicality problem there at all. Okay, so I'm going to foreshadow something. I'm going to argue that in almost every setting in our work, we can only explain. Okay, that's kind of my argument. There's one takeaway. Now we're going to talk about ways we can get closer to the other two, right? But that's my main argument today. All right, solutions to the problem of P. One is pre-specification. So we know this. There's like a journal of political science that requires this. You're seeing this more in econ. This isn't quite required in strategy yet, but if I were running some sort of randomized controlled trial or a field experiment, I would definitely do this, because regardless of what the journal requires, your statements are stronger if you pre-specify. So why not pre-specify? Okay. Notice that replication is a form of pre-specification if you're using the same sample or the same population, because the first article is essentially a roadmap of what you shall do in the second in the replication. Right? So this solution from Science about replication, which is used more generally than just p-values, but is kind of built into our statistical thinking. The second solution is, let's just make pre-specification irrelevant by analyzing any possible plausible specification. So if you can say, I'm going to analyze everything, and then no matter what I had pre-specified, I would arrive at the same conclusion, it's kind of an interesting statement, right? And that's called epistemic mapping, okay? And then the third solution, and this is kind of we're back to explanations, is just to make weaker claims. No longer make statements about, here's what I will find in the population. Make more limited statements about, this is the best explanation for my data. All right? Now that is not, now notice the difference. That's not an inductive statement, right? It's not ampliative. It's a story about my data, not about the population. Okay. So epistemic maps, so that red line there is going to mean something in a second. Okay. All right. So this is, you might have noticed the forking paths thing I had before. And so an epistemic map is to take every permutation of these forking paths and to run all those regressions and see how the results vary across regressions. So in this particular graph, there's somewhere around 3,400 different regressions that we ran using different sampling decisions, different dependent variables, different ways to calculate the predictor variable, different permutations of controls. And in this one, we only have one time period, but you could put them both onto one graph if you really wanted to. And each one of these is a different regression. The red line is the zero line, and the gray area is a confidence interval. So what you can see is very few of these regressions are significant. Very few of the coefficients would you reject the null. They're not significant in conventional levels. All right. Okay, so that's an example that no matter what you run, it's really hard to make a general conclusion. In this map, which is a completely different project, we see a pretty robust negative coefficient across a whole bunch of different specifications. Okay, all right, and so here we could make a stronger statement about what we believe this relationship to be. So that's kind of cool. Right. Now, I've done this. These are both papers of mine. Right? And I've done this, and I can tell you that this looks like a really good solution, and it's better. It's an improvement, but there's still a lot of judgment that goes into what to include and what to exclude from the map. Okay. I'm just going to leave that there for the moment. All right. Now we're going to talk about belief claims. So belief claims require causal identification, and you have to show that the data are likely given H and unlikely given not H, which is just everything else. So here's the coolest thing. When I realized this, I was like, oh, this is just beautiful. It's just, there's an elegance to this, right? So randomization, so Angress and Pischke, labor economists, are very much about, we should just be doing RCTs. Randomized controlled trials all the time, and that's how we should progress in the future. And what's magical about RCTs, it's such a great solution, is that they quantify, they say, because of randomization, that's the only other alternative explanation, because you have randomized, right? And you can quantify the likelihood that randomization is driving your results. And that's basically P. It's really cool. It's like really quite beautiful. Randomization means you don't have to think about all the other alternative explanations. Now there's quasi-randomized, because RCTs are difficult.
there's a lot of there's other solutions, instrumental variables, diffs and diffs, regression, discontinuity designs, what have you, right? Those are all versions of randomizations. They're trying to leverage randomization, right? And as I'm sure you've learned in your metrics classes, they're hard to do. They're not, like these are all hard solutions, right? And moreover, once we're in that world, pre-specification really can't happen very easily at all, right? James Heckman has argued that we should just assume away alternatives. And this is what you see in, say, a structural econometric model, because otherwise we can't make useful predictions, because we really want to know what the causal effects are. And sometimes we can rule out, sometimes you can get halfway, where you can say, I can rule out this class of theories, but not this class of theories, and that's still progress. Okay, there's my little graph on p-values, you know, and how people, that's a joke. Okay, just to be clear, don't do this. All right. And then this is what I like to call the unassailable veridicality of explanations. So they're useful when you can't imagine all other alternative explanations, which is a little bit of, you know, there's this thing called unknown unknowns. Right? So, you know, genetic sequencing, the arrival in that technology completely recast theories of human development and evolution. Because now we could sequence genomes in different populations, and we realized that it wasn't that humans split off from Neanderthals, but they intermarried. And in fact, there's all these different genetic groups, and we're just a mess, right? But no one thought of that and understood that until you had human genome sequencing. So if you were theorizing in the 1980s, you didn't have complete information, and you didn't even know you didn't have complete information. Right, so that's kind of an unknown unknown, and that's just the nature of science, right? So anyway, so they're useful when you can't imagine all other explanations, when you can't pre-specify, when you have some sort of unquantifiable prior, right? So if you're using qualitative information to inform your judgment, right? That is a form of, you can't, I don't know how to quantify that, right? Okay. And what's neat about this is once you have an explanation, it is no longer a statement of, it's no longer a claim of replicability. You're not saying I can repeat this and you will find this pattern. You're saying something different. It's like, I'm looking at my data and this is the best explanation for the patterns I see. That's a very different sort of thing. So then if you can suggest that in other circumstances you might see the same thing and you can make an argument why, but that's all you can do. How am I doing for time? I've got like a minute left. Okay. So how do IBE and how do abduct? So when we talk about explanation, sometimes you hear the language of abduction around. There's a nice AMR that Andy Vanderven just put out on abduction. There's statements about abduction. Will Mitchell calls this, he has this talk about red state and blue state papers, and I can't remember if it says red state or blue state, but it's one of them. Is sometimes you call this a fax paper, right? They're all basically IBE type papers, or inference to the best explanation. One thing that I will clarify is that abduction is kind of an older term, and there is a really robust and active community in the philosophy of science talking about inference to the best explanation. It's really interesting. There's a whole literature about it, okay? And you can see that some conjectures can cohere. So there's this idea that some conjectures cohere with background knowledge and explain more, and some explain more facts. Okay? So for example, Simmons and Uri Simonson, and who's the third person in all that work, they have a nice little experiment where they get a result that listening to the song When You're 64 makes you younger. Okay, and they've got a nice statistically significant coefficient that shows you that. Right? So
So that's an example where the statistics are telling you one thing, but you're going to throw that out because we know that listening to the Beatles will not make you younger. Perhaps listening to other bands will, we don't know, but certainly listening to the Beatles, not going to make you younger. Okay, so so instead what we do is we just kind of reason to the best explanation. It's called abduction. And this is an ongoing area of, I'm actually working on this now. It's a really, really interesting thing to go. Okay, presented statistics that we read in the literature usually overstate the likelihood of finding the pattern in a repeat sample. Okay, not veridical. That really leaves us with conjectures about the population. Okay. That leaves us, a conjecture is a theory. It might be a data-informed theory, but it's a theory. So basically, AMJ is really a theory journal. It's not an empirical journal. It's a data-informed theory journal. Okay, I'm a grad student. What do I forking do with all this? Okay. First, make sure your claims are veridical. Oops, what happened to the rest of my slide? Okay. One, make sure your claims are veridical. If you can only make explanations, if you can only claim an explanation, just say that. Note that this puts a lot of stress on H's first and then testing, because it's not a good test and it's hard to interpret the p-value if you do not know, if you haven't pre-specified. So if you can pre-specify, great. If you can do an epistemic map, great. And I will supply you with some resources on that, right? But, and here's the big but, if you have to go back and forth with your data to figure it out, write your paper in a way that clarifies that this is what you have done. Because if you do not do that, if you then go back and put those H's up, which implies they came before you worked with your data, you are misleading your readers. You're asking them to interpret the p-values at face value, and that is not a veridical claim. It's not a justified claim. So that's my plea to all of you. I will point out that SMJ, SEJ, and even management science, I don't know about the other journals as much because I'm not, are becoming much friendlier to this style of writing and research. Okay, that's all I have. There were some other things, but I think I accidentally put it on a different show, but I just summarized them.